Hi, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's EDGE webinar on the topic of upholding diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and practices in the US. I'm David Pritchett, and I'm the Managing Director of EDGE Certified Foundation. Today's webinar will last around 30 minutes and include a short Q&A opportunity at the end, so please post your questions in the chat during the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. Really excited to welcome you all today. A lot has happened in the DE&I in the workplace over the last few years. Organizations such as yourselves have made great strides in implementing DEI-related programs and initiatives, which have brought positive results for many of you. However, DEI is one of those acronyms that seems to stir debate and controversy among high-profile leaders in the US. There's been a lot of, and continues to be a lot of, media attention and noise around anti-DEI regulation in the US market. And DEI is also a business area where the majority of us on this webinar are actively and professionally working in, and we care a lot about. So we at EDGE Certification felt that it was important to shed some light for you, our valued stakeholders, on these issues from a US perspective. So it's my great pleasure to introduce as my guest and expert for today's discussion, Chai Feldblum. Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
Chai, just a short introduction to you. Chai has extensive experience and has had a long and distinguished career in social justice, civil rights, and DEI-related areas. Chai is a long-time civil rights advocate and scholar, specializing in issues regarding LGBTQ plus people with disabilities, and women. Chai was a law professor at Georgetown Law in Washington, D.C. for many years, helping nonprofit organizations advance their legislative social justice goals through a federal legislation clinic staffed by law students. Chai has helped draft and negotiate the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and spearheaded, and as a commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has spearheaded coverage of LGBTQ plus people under sex discrimination law, enhanced protection for pregnant workers, and strengthened government affirmative action goals for people with disabilities. And she currently serves as the vice chair of the AbilityOne Commission, a federal agency devoted to the employment of people with significant disabilities. So thank you, Chai. Given your legal background and extensive experience, let's jump into the conversation and start off with perhaps a question from a legal perspective. What is it about US anti-discrimination law that makes aggressively increasing DEI in the workplace complicated for organizations at this point in time?
So what makes it complicated is not so much the words of the laws that we have prohibiting discrimination based on, I'll focus mostly on race and sex for this conversation, given a lot of what EDGE does, although we'll reference some others, but how those words have been interpreted by the courts, including most recently. So in 1964, this law is passed. It says very simply, employers cannot discriminate on the basis of race or sex. From the very beginning, the courts were clear that meant, for example, you couldn't discriminate against a white person as well as a black person. You can't say, no, we're not hiring any white people. You can't discriminate against men as well as women. But early on, the courts did give flexibility to employers to take race or sex into account in certain circumstances, basically when they were trying to remedy societal discrimination, and they could show they had a disparity in their workforce. They didn't have the same percentage of Black employees or women that you would expect based on the number of qualified Black people or women. So that sort of was the case for some time. Now, in the educational setting, there were many more decisions at the Supreme Court, decisions that allowed race to be taken into account pretty explicitly in the application process, again, because it was remedying lack of diversity at the educational institution. So we still don't have a Supreme Court opinion in employment, but sure many people know the Harvard case that the Supreme Court decided. The Supreme Court said very clearly, we never take race into account in the application process, and increasing diversity in your educational setting is not a significant enough interest. Now, even though that's just the educational setting, the logic, we can expect lower courts to be applying that in the employment setting And in particular, it's invigorated almost an industry of filing charges with the EEOC. For those who don't know, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is the federal agency charged with enforcing the laws, filing charges with the EEOC, and filing cases. An invigorated industry out there.
Exactly. No, I think that's really, really insightful background. Thank you so much. I mean, what I think many of us on this webinar would like to hear is, how does this environment impact employers and organizations generally?
Well, the goal of the organizations bringing these challenges is to scare employers from doing anything. That's their goal. They know that actually the law still allows employers to do a lot. They want to scare employers from doing anything. That's their goal. And it's well-funded organizations. I mean, the three main ones are America First Legal, Americans Alliance for Equal Rights, and Do No Harm. You go on their websites, you will see everything that they're trying to do. So that's what they're trying to do, even though they may not actually win in court. And what they are charging, their focus is DEI efforts, including particularly focus on challenging diversity numerical targets, fellowships, other programs restricted to people of color or women, and certain types of DEI trainings. So that's their main focus at the moment. And the goal is to scare employers.
Right. And very, very coordinated action, as you say. So how, from an employer perspective, what should be the response? How would you say employers should respond to this?
Well, again, as someone who's worked in this for years and years, I mean, my first message is, don't cave in. Don't cave in. Do the things you legally can still do, right? Remain responsive to societal change, to stakeholders. Remain true to yourselves. But second, be smart, strategic, and thoughtful. Don't do things that we now know could get you into trouble under US law, as such laws are currently being interpreted, but develop a coherent strategy and targeted operational activities that lets you move forward, but with reduced legal risk. And I say reduced legal risk because the charges will come regardless, right? But you can set it up so you are much better situated in terms of dealing with them. That's what I say the response should be.
Yeah, that really, really sound advice. Thanks. I mean, that's why we're having this discussion, really, for us at Edge Certified Foundation, to really explore and maybe dig a little bit deeper into what organizations should still be doing, if you can scratch the surface a little bit more, and what they should potentially stay away from or refrain from doing in this environment.
Yeah,
from a DE&I and the workplace perspective.
Right. So I know that's the most helpful. You come to this webinar and it's like, okay, give me some specifics, right? So what I just gave you is the 30,000 foot, the overarching, but now let's dig in a bit, okay? Number one, you can continue to collect data of all kind, right? If you want to still do what you want to do in terms of creating a certain type of workplace, know thyself is the first rule. And you can collect data on your demographic statistics, both representation at all different levels, data on your processes and how those processes may be impacting outcomes, and data on culture. These are all things that are necessary and completely legal. Okay. So now when you think about know thyself and the data, it's important to disaggregate what DEI is, right? The D, the E, and the I, because there are different legal issues. So diversity is your representation. What do your statistical data show, right? That's your representation. You want to increase representation. Equity is that once you have people of all perspectives and characteristics in your workplace, are they being treated fairly? This is basically application of anti-discrimination laws. And then inclusion is, what's your workplace culture? Now, the legal issues are most tricky in the diversity. So I want to talk about some practical approach to that, but I want to stress that being good on equity and inclusion is going to be key, because it's going to be key to retaining people that you might have brought in, which is the whole point ultimately for your workforce demographics. Okay, so representation. Once you have your data, what are the action steps you're going to take? Now, the most straightforward way to do this is to say, oh my God, we have like no Black people and no women in leadership. Let's just say the next two people we promote to leadership, one of them should be a woman, or one of them should be a Black person. I mean, that's the most effective way of doing it. That has never been permitted under the law in the US, because it is taking race or gender into account, right? So it's been illegal, but it's always been legal to say we have this aspirational goal, right, of increasing, and we'll achieve that aspirational goal through various activities, right? And some companies have even said, and our aspirational goal is to increase participation of women, employment by 20%, right? Or 20% of our leadership should be women, right? I mean, they've given these specific targets and put it down. And that now is a red flag. It's a red flag. So my main recommendation here in this area is say less and do more. Now, it's not that you say nothing, okay, because that's going to be important for inclusion, but focus on doing outcomes. Yeah. And are not so focused on the targeted numbers. The other thing companies were sometimes doing was saying to managers in your performance, assessments, we're going to see, have you diversified your team? Again, that's sort of back to numbers. Okay, so if I'm saying take activities now, some of these have been done before, but now it's like, you really need to do it. So you want better representation, really think about where you're recruiting, right? I mean, you can recruit from places where there's a higher percentage of women or Black people, Black women, it's especially like on fellowships and stuff. I worked for 2 years in a management law firm, Morgan Lewis, counseling clients, right? For a fellowship, they recruited in these high schools that, they were in low-income neighborhoods and had disproportionate number of Black students, Black women of color, girls of color. So really focus on the recruiting. 2, use networking from the people currently in your workplace who might know other qualified women, people of color. I'm sure people have noticed, I've noticed this. If a fellow commissioner is Black, I don't know, there are more Black people working in that office. What's going on? She has better networks, right? So it's not like you're paying people to do it. You're not like you're trying to get numbers, but you are engaging the help of the people currently in your workplace. 3, keep working on your applicant pool until you actually have people who have the range of characteristics that you want. Again, it's not like saying you must have, women in the applicant pool. Just if you don't, just keep going. And which is very hard, by the way, as someone who has hired people and it's like, I have to hire someone right now. I don't know, take that extra 2 weeks, try to get that diverse applicant pool. And finally, this is my last thing. This is one client that did this. I thought it was so smart. You have to be large, really, to do this. So to anyone who's listening. So on a hiring team, let's say you have 2 people, they're hiring someone in their division. If you have one other person, not from that division, but who's like holding the characteristic, gender, race, that you want, have them be part of that hiring team. So they're listening during the interview. And then when the team comes together to compare the people they've interviewed, you have someone else who's listening. And instead of trying to give the hiring managers implicit bias training, which is sort of hard, just have someone else who can hear what people are saying and can say, well, what, you think the woman isn't as qualified because A or B, but what about the fact that she also did C? Which, see, so it's sort of say less, do more. And then again, in terms of when I say collecting data, you want to make sure you have representation at all levels, in your leadership levels. Collect data on what's going on in terms of performance appraisals. The research shows that white managers often do not give as much feedback to their Black employees, either positive or critical. Well, that's sometimes problematic when it comes to then promotions, because if you give feedback, you're more engaged with the person. So just figure out how your processes are working and what your data is showing in terms of outcomes. And again, if there's an issue, it's not like you're coming down on the manager, you're just having a conversation. Maybe you're just saying, please make sure to give feedback along the way, not just at your final review. So these are all concrete ideas in terms of diversity representation. And then last thing I'll say in terms of leadership training or fellowships, I mean, the best idea at this point is probably to offer such programs broadly, but the court in the Harvard case said very clearly, you can ask someone how race has affected their life, you know, their dreams, their aspirations. The Harvard case said that, you know, and I saw one of the consent agreements with one of these organizations and an employer that had had a fellowship just for Black physicians. The consent agreement was they will ask applicants how race has affected their desires, aspirations, etc. Follow that language. So that's representation. Let me say briefly in terms of equity and inclusion. So equity is just you're treating people fairly. It's basically that the anti-discrimination laws are being applied rigorously. Not any problem with that. Not any problem with training in what is discrimination, what is harassment. That training, absolutely fine. You got to keep going with that. And now inclusion is where I was saying you say less, but you still say something, okay? But here, the inclusion pieces should be about having a safe and respectful workplace generally, a place about having diversity across a range of areas, right? And you might still obviously have various sort of diversity trainings, but to the extent the attacks have happened, they've been trainings that are experienced as pedantic, and you're telling me about white supremacy and white privilege and, you know, white fragility, or pedantic about, you know, what sexism is. Personally, I think this all makes sense to do, but in the current legal environment, you want to think about how you're doing that training. And I think as a complement, you want to add safe and respectful workplaces training, which is about having everyone being treated with respect, not just based on a particular characteristic. When I do the training, I do it with, you know, how do you have respectful behavior and not have uncivil behavior for anyone? And then the piece on harassment, which is not having uncivil behavior or other adverse behavior based on particular characteristics. But you're doing it in a more holistic manner.
Right.
Some ideas.
Fantastic, Kai. Really, I mean, very in-depth analysis through the D, the E, and the I. I think the diversity and the data perspective, you weighed heavily on that. So keep collecting that data, manage the risk, but collect that data. Assess the effectiveness of your policies and practices within an organization. Look at where you have opportunities to drive that, accelerate that performance of an organization through those policies and practices, which is great. You had some good examples there. And finally, the inclusion aspect, which you highlighted so importantly at the end, and understanding the perceptions of your employees and the experiences that your employees are actually feeling, and how you can actually create solutions to address some of those gaps there. So the DE and the I, thank you for that. We've already got a lot of questions coming in, so perhaps I'll just ask one more question, Kai, from my perspective. And it's something that I noticed last week in an article, and I've seen this come up again and again in the media. There's data now showing that DEI terms are being used less in public reporting from US organizations. And I think this is probably reflected in the 2023 reports, which are coming out in 2024. And the terminology DEI is being replaced with terms like diverse experiences or belonging or other similar, but not exactly the same acronyms for DEI. What do you think about that?
Well, it's not surprising. I've seen it. I think it's sad because we have a sort of mismatch between where our society in the US has moved aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. I mean, there are lots of ways in which people now understand the impact of this, and the best way is to be able to respond directly with language directly to stopping racism, increasing diversity, etc. But I certainly understand it. I know you have general counsels on the call. I understand the legal utility of reframing. I actually don't fault that. But I guess what I would stress is that employers can change their language and still achieve diversity on the basis of many characteristics, including sex and gender. Okay, this is not an or situation. This is an and. We want diversity across a range of lines, including race, gender, etc. See, just broadening it, because we are all diverse. We all are different. I mean, I grew up that much money, low-income neighborhood in New York. I will tell you, that made me diverse in a lot of the settings I've worked in, right? And it affects my identity. Yeah. So that's fine if you're saying, we want to ask about where you grew up and how that affected you. Because, you can also ask about how your gender or race has affected you. That the Harvard case has that as a line. So you can still use the broader language. In fact, there's some silver lining to that, even though there's negative stuff from my perspective, and achieve your result. Achieve your result. Stand true to your values. Oh, and I'll say one last thing before we get to your other questions, because it's all about, for example, general counsel saying we need to minimize risk. Yes, you need to minimize risk, but you need to think about risk broadly. Yeah, there's a risk that you're going to spend money, defending something. But if you do nothing, the risk is there's going to be a range of consumers that won't be happy. You will not attract the same number of employees who are women or Black people, and that's going to affect who else you can bring in. So which will then affect your bottom line as a business. Right. So when you think about risk, think about it broadly.
No, very, very good advice. I mean, listen, at Edge, and we've taken this feedback to heart at Edge. I mean, we've reviewed our Edge certification standards and assessment methodology and ensured that our standards offer a safe and effective approach to increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace within the confines of US law. This is something which was very important to us to make sure that we did that in this developing and evolving landscape. I mean, part of our methodology, Chai, does contain elements around aspirational targets, and you touched on the aspirational targets earlier, that particular topic. So perhaps we can delve a little bit into that. Our methodology does contain elements around aspirational targets and incorporating objectives, for example, into performance evaluation of managers specifically. Is this legally permissible? How can we make this part legally permissible in the US, for example?
Right. And I appreciated being able to review that and provide some ideas. And look, goals, targets, focus the mind. I mean, that does make sense. But I think the key thing is that you say, we have the data, we want to increase, right, the diversity. And then your action plan very clearly indicates how you're doing that in legally permissible ways. And so the stuff about recruiting, the stuff about making sure you have diversity in your applicant pool, and fine, try to get diversity in people growing up low income, that's the thing. It's not like you cannot have it, but you just want to be careful in terms of how you describe it on your website and language. It's different from, here's the data, okay, here's my internal sort of goal. And now, instead of in the performance review of the manager saying, show me your numbers, it's to the manager, show me what you did. Show me what your applicant pool was like. You know what I mean? So it's really the action plan to those goals.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks. We've got an interesting question with the whole landscape of elections coming up. How do you see the DEI field evolving over the next few years, given the current and potential future political environment in the US might change? Good question, I think, as arguably, I mean, none of the issues that gave rise to DEI policies in the first place are going away anytime soon. So how do you see the future playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this. I mean, the reality is that the 4 years of a President Trump administration affected our Supreme Court significantly, and that's the most important factor in what's going to happen. So that's already happened. That's not going to change. I mean, there may be more of a feeling of allowance of being able to challenge certain things, but I actually think that's here, that's now, that's funded. Regardless of what happens politically, I think that continues. So there might be other changes and difficulties for the United States, but I think here you just have to assume what's here is here, and now we have to deal with it.
Right. Yes, I understand. We have quite a lot of our audience are European-based multinationals, European-based multinationals with either subsidiaries in the US or they're working for subsidiaries of US organizations in Europe. So we have about a 50-50 audience split on today's webinar, which is quite interesting. Question coming in here from a multinational, which is European-based. How could the organization or the professionals working in the DI space support and even facilitate the leaders and management effectively navigate when you're working cross-border in such a polarized environment?
Yeah, I mean, so there's an important legal difference between most countries in Europe and here, which is that in Europe, not only can you explicitly take gender, race, into account, but actually may be required to in terms of having certain representation, which is the most logical and effective way of getting to the result we want. So there is need to understand that that's not the same in the US, except for disability and age. So in the ADA, as amended, we wrote a specific sentence that said there is no reverse discrimination claim under the ADA. Person without a disability cannot bring a claim. So you absolutely can say, in this next year, we want to hire 3 people with disabilities. Same thing if you say, we want to hire a few people over the age of 40. So those two are permitted in the way that it is obviously permitted in Europe and even some cases required. So there has to be that understanding of the difference, but it's like stay true to the ultimate goal, which is you want a widely representative workplace. And if anything, I think multinational companies embody that in practice. You know what I mean? You're going to other countries, you're learning. So I think see it as a strength, but be very aware of the legal realities in the United States as you expand into it.
Yeah, I agree. I think most organizations that we have experience with believe in staying firmly committed to DE&I. I think that's the general feeling. Yet we understand that it can feel so polarizing with these legal fears and concerns, which can override, I think, in some quarters, those good intentions that organizations might have in DE&I with that sort of as you say, you get scared with the tactics that are employed.
Let me say one quick thing before.
Yeah, one quick final thing. I think we're almost time's up, Kai, so please go ahead.
But just don't underestimate the commitment of people in this country to DEI.
Yeah.
Just don't, there's a mismatch between sometimes societal feeling and law. They want you to stay true. Okay, over to you.
No, I think so. I think this is the way we feel as well. Can businesses continue to lead the way in DE&I? I think we feel that they are doing so. We get that impression of the commitment of the organizations to DE&I in the workplace, of undertaking EDGE certification, for example, as a vehicle to show that commitment. It's also helping them to facilitate their compliance ultimately with the generally moving targets of the regulatory environment, especially in the EU, around the ESG and which incorporates the DEI space. So there's a sort of a lot happening over here in the EU on that space. And so these kinds of measures, I think, some commitments can really help to facilitate that. And of course, we've all read the the good stories about the competitive advantage that this creates for an organization in some of the business case areas, and some of the numbers that our friends at McKinsey and Bain and organizations like that are really got some great analytics on the business case of how this is playing out to working with DE&I. So thank you so much, Chai. I think on behalf of everyone, we've reached the 30-minute time. Thanks for your time today. Hugely insightful on the current landscape in the US, on the US market and how that's playing out. And thank you, all of you, for your participation. And I hope that you've seen this of equal value as I have. So I wish you all a great rest of the day. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.